There are towns in the Canadian West where winter arrives before anyone is ready, and somehow the community holds together anyway. Not because the people are exceptional, though some of them are, but because the alternative is not surviving, and survival, in that part of the world, has always been a collective project. In Dunmore, Alberta, in the autumn of 1889, the person everyone quietly organized themselves around without quite admitting it was Cecily Harte. She was 28 years old, the postmistress and schoolteacher, which in a town of 400 souls was not two jobs but one continuous act of holding the community in her hands. She had brown hair she kept practical, and dark eyes that caught everything and gave back only what she chose. She was the kind of woman who remembered which children were struggling with arithmetic and which fathers were too proud to ask for credit, and she kept both kinds of information with the same quiet discretion. She was funny in the dry way of someone who has seen enough of people to find them genuinely absurd and still fundamentally worth the trouble. Every eligible man in Dunmore had, at some point, considered Cecily Harte. A few had done more than consider. There had been an invitation from the new hardware merchant that she declined over a letter she was sorting. There had been flowers from the Methodist minister's cousin, visiting from Lethbridge, who had apparently decided that 3 days of acquaintance was sufficient. There had been a formal approach from a widower, with a prosperous farm east of town who had made his offer with the serious efficiency of a man accustomed to negotiating cattle prices. Cecily had declined all of them, warmly, without cruelty, with the particular kindness that made the rejection harder to argue with because there was nothing to push against. People had theories. She was too independent. She had standards no man in Dunmore could meet. She was waiting for someone from Calgary or Edmonton, someone with more education, more prospects, more something. None of them were right. The answer was simpler than anyone supposed and considerably more inconvenient, and it had a name. The name was Fletcher Caine. And he was the one man in Dunmore who had never once thought to ask. What no one knew, not even Fletcher, was that time was starting to run short. Fletcher Caine was 32 years old and ran the telegraph office and small freight operation on the north end of Main Street. He was not the most prosperous man in Dunmore. He was not, strictly speaking, the most remarkable in any category you could name at a town meeting and have people nod in immediate agreement. He was medium height, with dark hair that needed cutting more often than he got around to cutting it, and hands that were permanently ink-stained from the telegraph work. He had a way of listening that made people tell him more than they intended, which he used with the instinctive tact of someone who understood that most information was given in trust. What Fletcher Caine was, without any debate, was decent, not in the performed way that announces itself, in the quiet way that shows up. He had extended credit to the Kowalski family after the early frost took their crop and never mentioned it to anyone, including the Kowalskis, until they were able to repay it. He had sat with old Henry Marsh through 3 nights of fever the previous winter because Henry had no family close enough to come. He gave honest weight, kept his word on delivery times, and when he was wrong about something, which happened, he was human. He said so directly without making it a production. He and Cecily had known each other since she arrived in Dunmore 6 years ago, fresh from a teaching college in Ontario with a trunk full of books, and the calm self-possession of someone who had decided early on who she was and saw no reason to revise it. They had fallen into the easy familiarity of neighbors who see each other daily and have never had occasion to be anything else. He stopped at the post office window most mornings. She handed him his mail and the day's telegrams that had come through. They talked about the weather and the freight schedules, and occasionally about the book she was reading, which he would sometimes borrow and return with comments in the margins that she had never mentioned and never stopped noticing. He thought about Cecily Harte the way you think about the river that runs through a town, aware that it is the reason the town exists where it does, grateful for its constancy, and somehow never quite considering that you might actually walk to its edge and put your hands in the water. On a Tuesday morning in October, he came to the post office, frowning at a ledger, with the concentrated expression of someone working out where a number had gone wrong. She did not look up immediately. "Morning," he said. She said, which was not unfriendly, just occupied. Then, a moment later, "Your freight manifest from Calgary came in. It's on the side." He took it. He left. Outside on the steps, Angus Drummond, who had been declined by Cecily the previous spring and had reached the philosophical stage of the experience, looked at Fletcher and shook his head. "I have watched you do that," Angus said. "Approximately 200 times. Do what? Come in. Take your mail, leave. Like a man picking up a parcel." Fletcher looked at him with genuine puzzlement. "That's what I'm doing." Angus looked at the gray October sky. "Right," he said. "Absolutely right." But Angus was thinking about something Fletcher didn't know yet. That Robert Aldcroft, the newly appointed land surveyor working the district for the Dominion government, had been in Dunmore for 3 weeks. That he was educated and presentable, and had a government salary and a future that involved eventually settling somewhere. That he had been to the post office 4 times in the past week for reasons that had nothing to do with mail. The Dunmore Harvest Social was held in the community hall on the last Saturday of October, before the cold came in earnest and shut down the appetite for gathering. Cecily had agreed to help organize it, which meant she had spent 2 weeks arranging things and would spend the evening making sure they continued to be arranged, which was not entirely what she would have chosen. She wore a dress the color of winter spruce, practical enough for a woman who would be moving chairs, and had her hair done in the way that meant she was making an effort without announcing that she was making an effort. She managed the evening with the capable ease of someone for whom competence is not a performance. Robert Aldcroft found her within the first hour. He was, she had to admit, a perfectly agreeable man. 34, trim, with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to arriving in new places and making himself useful. He had read things. He could hold a conversation. He asked her to dance with the assurance of a man who expected a yes and was not wrong to expect it. She danced with him because it would have been unkind not to. He was a good dancer. He was also, she noticed, watching her with the particular attentiveness of a man who had made a decision and was working out the steps to execute it. Not unpleasant. Just deliberate, the kind of deliberate that meant something was coming. Across the room, Fletcher arrived late, in the reliable way of a man who has managed freight schedules all day and considered a social obligation a different kind of logistics problem. He accepted a cup of cider from the table near the door, exchanged a few words with the miller's son, and then simply stood and watched the room with the comfortable ease of someone who likes people without needing to be in the center of them. He saw Cecily dancing with Aldcroft. He noticed, vaguely, that she was being patient in the particularly gracious way she had, giving her full attention to someone who hadn't quite earned it yet. She caught his eye across the room. For just a moment, something in her face shifted, not the capable, organized expression she'd been wearing all evening, but a different one, quick and private, and for him, gone before he could quite catalog what it was. He lifted his cup in a small acknowledgement. Then someone tapped his shoulder about a delayed freight shipment, and he turned away with the easy obliviousness of a man who does not know what he just walked past. On the other side of the room, Cecily watched him turn away. She looked back at Robert Aldcroft, who was watching her with that careful, evaluating attention, and she felt, for the first time, something she had been successfully not feeling for quite a while. The first quiet edge of the understanding that patience has a natural limit, and she was approaching hers. 4 days after the social, Cecily was sorting the morning's mail when her colleague Agnes Pell, who managed the post office afternoons and knew everything that happened in Dunmore within 48 hours of it happening, said, without looking up from her own sorting, "Aldcroft's been asking after you. Has he, to the Drummond family, about your situation?" whether you had anyone particular. Agnes set down a parcel. The kind of questions a man asks before he makes a formal approach. Cecily continued sorting. A letter from Ontario, a seed catalog, 2 telegrams for the mill. He seems settled on staying in the district, Agnes said. Government work, good prospects. She paused. I thought you should know, is all. Cecily finished the stack she was sorting. She carried it to the window ledge and began filing. Thank you, Agnes, she said, and said nothing else. But her hands were slightly slower than usual for the rest of the morning, and when Fletcher came to the window at 9:10, as he did every morning, and took his mail, and said, Cold one today, and she said, It is. Neither of them said anything else, and he left, and she stood for a moment after the door swung closed and looked at nothing in particular. Not much longer, she thought. And meant it for the first time. Angus Drummond found Fletcher at the freight office on a Thursday afternoon and did not waste time. Aldcroft's going to make a formal offer to Cecily Harte, he said, probably before the month's out, possibly sooner the way he's moving. Fletcher was sorting a manifest. He didn't look up immediately. Where'd you hear that? From my mother, who heard it from Agnes Pell, who has no reason to fabricate anything because she already knows everything and doesn't need to. Angus settled into the chair across the desk. I'm telling you because you are my friend, and because, as your friend, I have a responsibility to tell you that you are the least self-aware man currently operating a business in Dunmore, Alberta. Fletcher set down the manifest. What has that got to do with anything? Angus looked at him with the particular patience of a man who has been waiting a long time for this conversation to happen. Fletcher, he said, do you understand that Cecily Harte has declined every man who has approached her in the 6 years she has lived in this town? Do you understand that there is a reason for that? Do you understand that the reason is currently sitting behind a freight desk pretending he doesn't know what I'm talking about? The office was quiet. Wind pressed against the window. A horse shifted outside. Fletcher looked at Angus for a long moment. She wouldn't. He started. She has, Angus said, for years. And Aldcroft doesn't know that. And if you don't do something about it, she's going to have to make a different kind of choice. Not because she wants to, because you left her no other option. He stood up. That's what I came to say. He left. Fletcher sat in the freight office for a long time after, with the particular stillness of a man whose entire understanding of something has just shifted under him quietly and completely, like ice going out in spring. Aldcroft. A month, maybe less. The manifest he'd been sorting was still in his hand. He set it down carefully. The way you set something down when you've just remembered that certain things don't stay available indefinitely just because they've always been there. He was at the post office window on a Friday morning, 3 days later. Cecily was behind the counter. Agnes was in the back. The morning mail had been sorted, and the early customers had come and gone, and there was a brief window of quiet that Dunmore occasionally produced between 8 and 9 before the day's business picked up. They were talking about the freight schedule, which was the comfortable default. And then Cecily said something dry about the reliability of the Calgary connection, and he laughed. And then, without planning it, without the kind of deliberate staging that he would have talked himself out of if he'd had more time to think, he set down the envelope he was holding and looked at her. Really looked, the way he occasionally had without meaning to over 6 years in the moments when he forgot to be casual about it. Cecil, he said. He hadn't called her that since they were new acquaintances, and he'd been slightly nervous and had gotten her name slightly wrong. It had become, without either of them commenting on it, the version of her name that meant something specific. She went still. Not startled. More like something in her had been waiting for its cue. I heard about Aldcroft, he said. I know I have no standing to say anything about that. I know I haven't given myself any standing. And that's on me, and I know it. He stopped, started again. But I need to tell you something before you make any decisions. I should have told you a long time ago, and I didn't because I spent 6 years convincing myself it was something I wasn't allowed to have, and I was wrong about that. Through the post office window, The main street of Dunmore continued its Friday morning business. Someone's wagon went past. A bell rang over the door of the hardware store across the street. She waited. "I love you," he said. "I think I have since about 4 months after you arrived, when you told old Mr. Pierce that his letter from his daughter in Manitoba was not late. The mail was early, and you said it with such complete conviction that he believed you and was cheerful about it for a week." He stopped. "I know that's a strange thing to remember, but I've never forgotten it." A pause. "I couldn't let Aldcroft come to this window and make it so that you never knew I saw you, because I do, I have. I just was too slow to say so." Cecily Harte looked at him across the post office counter. Outside, the October wind moved through the main street of Dunmore. Agnes could be heard distantly moving something in the back room. Then Cecily said quietly, "Fletcher Caine, I have been handing you your mail every morning for 6 years." A pause. "I have read the comments you left in the margins of every book you borrowed and never once said a word about them." Another pause. "I turned down a farmer, a merchant, a minister's cousin, and a man who offered my landlady actual money to find out my schedule." She held his gaze. "I was not waiting because I had run out of other options." He stayed very still. "Don't," she said, "make me wait anymore. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. What part of the world are you listening from today? Drop it in the comments. It means more than you know to understand where these stories are reaching. Now, back to Dunmore, because Fletcher Caine still has some things to do. He came to the post office the following Monday morning with the particular expression of a man who has arrived somewhere and intends to stay. Agnes was at the front counter. She looked at him, took in the good shirt, the combed hair, the settled look of someone who has stopped deliberating, and said nothing whatsoever. Simply turned toward the back and called, "Cecily, Fletcher's here." A pause. Then footsteps. Then Cecily came through the door from the sorting room and stopped, and the look she gave him was clear and direct and entirely without the careful, organized composure she wore for the general public. "Just, you came. I'd like to call on you properly," he said. "Starting this week, if you're willing, and with your aunt's permission, since she's your nearest family in the district, and I'd rather do this right than fast." From the front counter, Agnes said, to no one in particular, "Her aunt is at the Mercantile on Tuesday afternoons. I have no strong feelings about what happens between Tuesday afternoons." Cecily looked at Fletcher. Something in her had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with stillness and everything to do with relief. The held breath finally let go. "You know," she said, "most men who come calling bring something." He looked at his hands, which were, it was true, entirely empty. "I'll bring something Wednesday." "Is there going to be a Wednesday?" "Every day," he said, "for as long as you'll have me." She looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled. Not the capable, organized smile she gave the general public, but the other one. The one he now understood had been there all along, waiting for him to recognize it. "Then don't be late," she said. What followed was the most thoroughly discussed courtship in Dunmore's recent memory. He brought preserves on Wednesday, not bought, but made by his neighbor, Mrs. Ferris, who had pressed them on him that morning with the suspicious enthusiasm of someone who had heard something. Cecily put them on the kitchen shelf of the post office residence without explaining them to anyone, which prompted Agnes to speculate elaborately to everyone who came through the door that week. He came to Sunday dinner at the home of Cecily's aunt, Harriet. Not Harriet Good from the list, an entirely different Harriet, Harriet Vance, who had lived in Dunmore for 20 years and held opinions about everything, and had apparently formed an opinion about Fletcher Caine a long time ago, because she welcomed him with the warm efficiency of someone who had been waiting for a particular package to finally arrive. The dinner was good. The conversation was easy. Cecily sat across from him, and they talked the way they always had. Easily, with the dry humor that had always been a current between them, except that now neither of them was pretending it was merely a habit of proximity. On a Sunday in November, before the heavy snow, they rode to the coulee above town, where you could see the whole valley laid out below. The river a dark line through the pale grass, the sky enormous the way it is on the prairies when the clouds are high and the light comes at an angle. They sat in the cold, clear air and talked honestly. "Why me?" he said. Not quite a question, the kind of thing a man says when he genuinely cannot account for the arithmetic. "Because you never performed anything," she said. "Every man who came to that window was showing me something. Their land, their salary, their intentions, their prospects. You came to pick up your mail." She looked at the valley. "And you left comments in the margins of my books and never mentioned it. For 6 years, and every one of those comments was exactly right." She paused. "That's not nothing, Fletcher." He was quiet for a moment. "Aldcroft's a good man, he is. You could have." "Fletcher," she turned to look at him directly. "I was not waiting because the other options were insufficient. I was waiting because I had already decided." A pause. "Don't make me explain that more than once." He looked at her. This woman who had held something carefully for 6 years and offered it to him without conditions and without reproach, as though it had simply been kept somewhere safe and was now available to collect. And he felt with a specificity that surprised him the full weight of what had almost not happened. How close it had been. How easily he might have stood at that window for another 6 years, handing her telegrams, while the river ran past the town, and the mountains stood where they always stood, and nothing changed until something did. The valley was pale gold below them. The early snow was on the high ground, and something that had been patient for a very long time sat down beside him in that cold November air and stopped waiting. He asked her on a December evening, outside the post office, after the community Christmas reading she had organized and half of Dunmore had attended. He had his grandmother's ring in his coat pocket, a simple thing, gold, with a small garnet that had sat in his desk drawer since his grandmother passed it to him 3 years ago with the pointed observation that it was not decorative. He had been carrying it for 2 weeks, waiting for a moment that felt honest. He stopped her on the post office steps and turned to face her. "Cecily," he said, "I need to say something plainly, because I have been unclear for long enough, and you deserve better than unclear." The December air was sharp. Her breath made small clouds. She waited. "I love you," he said. "I have for years, which is not a point in my favor. I understand that. But I know it now the way I know the things I don't question. And I would like you to be my wife. If you're willing to take on a man who was slow and is doing his best to make up for the time he spent not knowing what he was looking at." Cecily regarded him. "Fletcher Caine," she said, "that is the least romantic proposal I have heard described in any book I have ever read." "I know. I thought about that on the way over. And this was the result. I could try again." "You could," she considered. The cold wind moved through the empty main street. The post office window was dark behind her. "Or," she said, "you could put the ring on my finger, because I can see it in your pocket from here, and you have been standing very carefully on my left side for the past 5 minutes. He looked down, then back at her. "Yes?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, Fletcher." "Yes." He put the ring on her finger, on the post office steps in the December dark, and she held her hand up and looked at it the way you look at something you have been expecting and are glad has finally arrived. They were married in February, the only month in Dunmore when a wedding guaranteed a full church, because there was nothing else to do in February and everyone was grateful for any occasion. Agnes Pell was in the second row and was observed to be unreasonably satisfied with herself for the entire proceedings. Robert Aldcroft attended, because he was a decent man, and stood near the back, and was later seen congratulating Fletcher with the particular graciousness of someone who has lost something fair and square. Cecily wore a dress her aunt had helped her make, cream wool with a high collar, practical for the season. She walked toward Fletcher with the specific certainty of a woman who has known where she was going for quite some time and is simply glad to have finally arrived. Fletcher stood at the front of the church and watched her come, and thought about the 6 years of mornings at the post office window, about the comments in the margins of borrowed books, about Angus in the freight office, and the manifest still in his hand, and the moment his understanding of something rearranged itself quietly and entirely. He was not going to waste a single day of what came next. They said their vows. Simply, they meant every word. The years that followed were good years, built on honest work and genuine liking, and the particular comfort of two people who had already been each other's company for a long time before they admitted it. The freight operation grew. Cecily kept teaching through the first years and kept the post office until a replacement could be properly trained, because she was not the kind of person who left a job half done, which Fletcher had always known and now had cause to appreciate in a different and more domestic way. She also, within the first 6 months, reorganized the freight ledgers in a way that recovered several outstanding accounts Fletcher had written off as lost, which she did without comment and he accepted without argument, because there was no argument to be made. Their daughter arrived in the 3rd year. They named her Frances, for Fletcher's mother, a child with her father's coloring and her mother's particular way of looking at something, direct and quiet, and as though she had already formed an opinion and was waiting to see if you would confirm it. Their son came 2 years later. They named him George, which had been Cecily's grandfather's name, and he arrived in the world with the uncomplicated good cheer of a person who expects things to go well, and is generally not wrong about that. On a summer evening in their 7th year, Fletcher came home from the freight office to find Cecily at the kitchen table with papers spread around her and Frances beside her, both of them studying something with identical expressions of concentrated attention. He stood in the doorway for a moment watching them. Cecily noticed him. She always noticed him, and looked up. "You're early," she said. "I am... Anything wrong at the office?" "Nothing wrong," he said. "I just came home." She looked at him for a moment with the particular look she had, the one he had spent 6 years not understanding, and had now spent 7 years being grateful for. Then she gathered the papers into a tidy stack with the brisk efficiency of someone who knows exactly where everything goes. Frances looked up from her side of the table. "Papa," she said, with the directness that was entirely her mother's, "are you just going to stand there?" "Probably for a minute," he said. "Is that all right?" Frances considered this. "I suppose," she said, and went back to her papers. Cecily stood up and crossed the kitchen to him, and he put his arm around her, in the simple way of people who have done it so many times it has stopped being an occasion, and become just the way things are, which is its own kind of extraordinary if you stop to notice it. Years later, when Frances was old enough to ask, she asked in the way that the children of happy people ask, not wondering if love is real, but wondering how it works. They were at the kitchen table again, Cecily teaching Frances to do the freight accounts, because Frances had announced at 14 that she intended to run something and saw no reason to wait to learn how. "How did you know?" Frances said, in the sideways manner of someone asking a real question inside a practical one, before he did. Cecily was quiet for a moment, checking a column of figures. "He never showed me anything," she said finally. "Every man who came to that post office window was presenting something, his intentions, his land, his future. Your father came to pick up his mail and left comments in my books that he never mentioned." She set down her pencil. "I knew who he was, not the version of himself he was performing, the actual person." A pause, that's rarer than people say. Frances absorbed this, "But you almost didn't wait, because of the surveyor." "Yes," Cecily was matter-of-fact about it. "Almost. Weren't you afraid?" Cecily looked at her daughter, Fletcher's eyes in her face, her own particular directness in the set of her jaw. "Of course," she said. "I was afraid he wouldn't see it. I was afraid I had decided on something that was never going to arrive." She was quiet for a moment. "But at a certain point you have to say the true thing and let the person decide. You can't wait indefinitely and call it love. At some point, waiting is just hoping, and hoping without saying anything is just..." She thought about it. "It's just being quiet in the direction of something." Frances turned this over. "So you said the true thing." I gave him the chance to show up. Cecily picked up her pencil. And he did. What if he hadn't? Cecily was quiet for a long moment. Then I would have known, she said, and I would have moved forward. It would have been painful, and I would have been all right, and that would have been that. She looked at her daughter. But Franny, when you say the true thing to the right person, in my experience, they show up. The thing about Cecily Harte is that she never waited passively. She ran the post office. She taught the children. She organized the harvest socials and kept the community accounts and read deeply and thought clearly and showed up every day as exactly herself, without performance, without diminishment, without pretending to be less certain than she was, in order to seem more approachable. And when the moment came, when she understood that time had its own arithmetic and hers was running, she said the true thing to a man at a post office window and walked into the back room and let it land. That is not a small thing. It cost something. And Fletcher isn't a man who failed. He's something more recognizable than that. A man so convinced that something extraordinary was simply part of the landscape of his life that he forgot it was the kind of thing a person could walk toward, until Angus sat down across his desk on a Thursday afternoon, until the clock that had been running quietly became suddenly, unmistakably loud. Sometimes that's what it takes, not the presence of love. They both had that, but the understanding that love, like the river that runs through a prairie town, does not wait for you to decide you're ready. It moves, and if you stand on the bank long enough without putting your hands in the water, eventually the season changes. They chose each other at the last reasonable moment, but still in time. That is the part worth holding.